From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The recent arrests that our fellow citizens are now learning about are a stark reminder that this nation is at war with Islamic fascists who will use any means to destroy those of us who love freedom, to hurt.
Britain has named and frozen the assets of 19 of 24 people arrested on suspicion of plotting to blow up passenger planes flying to the United States. All of them are British citizens. Most are believed to be of Pakistani descent. We'll go to Britain to take a look at why many British Muslims are skeptical of the plot and fear a backlash on their communities. Then a Democracy Now! National broadcast exclusive, AWOL and in hiding. An Army sergeant on the run for a year speaks out. He was a military interrogator in Iraq. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. British officials have named and frozen the assets of 19 of 24 people being held on suspicion of plotting to blow up passenger jets making flights to the United States. Police said the plan was to take liquid explosives disguised as drinks on up to 10 planes with detonators hidden in electronic devices. This is London Deputy Police Commissioner Paul Stevenson.
We believe that the terrorist aim was to smuggle explosives onto aeroplanes in hand luggage and to detonate these in flight. We also believe that the intended targets were flights from the United Kingdom to the United States of America.
Those arrested are all British citizens aged 17 to 35. Most are believed to be of Pakistani origin. One of the suspects is said to be a young mother. British authorities say they've been investigating the suspects for about a year. Pakistan says it's played a role in thwarting the plot. A senior government official said Pakistan arrested 2 Britons of Pakistani descent last week in a coordinated operation. While British authorities said all the main figures have been caught, ABC News quoted unnamed U.S. officials saying 5 suspects are still on the loose. The news sparked chaos at Britain's airports at the height of the summer holiday season. Hundreds of flights were canceled as airlines imposed strict security measures. Armed police have been deployed in many airports, and passengers are no longer allowed to take their hand luggage into the cabin. Authorities said the airlines to be targeted were United, American, and Continental on flights bound for New York, Washington, and California. Here in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security has raised the security alert to its highest level for the first time. This is Department of Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff.
There is currently no indication of any plotting within the United States. Nevertheless, as a precaution, the federal government is taking immediate steps to increase security measures with respect to aviation. First of all, the United States government has raised the nation's threat level to our highest level of alert, severe or red, for commercial flights originating in the United Kingdom and bound for the United States.
Meanwhile, the disclosure of the alleged plot is raising questions over the nature of the Bush administration's reaction to the loss of Senator Joseph Lieberman. Just a day before the plot was announced, White House Press Secretary Tony Snow said Lieberman's defeat signaled Democrats are, quote, raising a white flag in the war on terror. In an unusual conference call with reporters, Vice President Dick Cheney said Democrats believe, quote, that somehow we can retreat behind our oceans and not be actively engaged in this conflict and be safe here at home, which clearly we know we won't be, he said. Critics say the White House's comments amount to political opportunism because officials were briefed on the alleged plot last week and knew it would soon be disclosed. In an interview with Agence France-Presse, a Republican congressional aide addressed the plot and said he'd rather be talking about this than all of the other things that Congress hasn't done well. A White House official added, weeks before September 11th, this is going to play big. As the U.S. and Britain deal with the possibility of another major attack, Lebanon continues to come under daily bombardment. In the suburbs of Beirut, at least 11 Lebanese civilians were killed and a dozen wounded in airstrikes earlier today. On Thursday, Israeli helicopters fired into central Beirut in an apparent attempt to knock out an antenna for Lebanese state television. At the UN, France and the United States are once again claiming to be near agreement on a resolution for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Republican Congressmember Daralisa of California was in Beirut on Thursday. He spoke after meeting with Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora.
Prime Minister and I spoke particularly about the need for an immediate ceasefire and the progress, the negotiations leading to that. I'm very hopeful that that will come in hours or days, and would very much believe that this will be a lasting peace. And that is what both sides are obviously interested in. And the United States wants to make an investment in that lasting peace.
Congressmember Issa is of Lebanese descent. In an effort to break the diplomatic impasse, Russia submitted its own proposal Thursday, calling for a 3-day humanitarian truce. Israel rejected the proposal. Meanwhile, the United Nations top humanitarian official is demanding immediate access for aid agencies in southern Lebanon. Speaking in Geneva, UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Jan Egeland said the fighting has cut off all assistance to some 120,000 Lebanese.
Lebanon is one of the worst places in the world in terms of humanitarian access. We have a couple of 100,000 people to whom we have zero access virtually. And it's a disgrace really, because the parties to the conflict, the Hezbollah and the Israelis, could give us access in a heartbeat. And then we could help 120,000 people in southern Lebanon.
Meanwhile, the New York Times is reporting the Bush administration is set to approve an Israeli request to speed delivery of missiles armed with cluster munitions. State Department officials are reportedly trying to delay the approval amid concerns of a diplomatic fallout over likely civilian casualties. The M-26 rockets carry hundreds of grenade-like bomblets that explode over a wide area. Israel says it needs them to strike Hezbollah missile launchers. Cluster sales were momentarily suspended during the Reagan administration following disclosures Israel used them against civilian targets during its first invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Last month, Human Rights Watch said Israel's shelling civilian areas with U.S.-made cluster bombs in violation of international law. According to the group, a cluster bombing of the village of Bilda killed 1 civilian and wounded 12 others, including 7 children. U.S. officials say Israel will likely get the rockets, but will be told, quote, to be careful. China has declared a state of emergency amidst its most powerful typhoon in 50 years. More than 1.5 million people have been evacuated from southeast areas. At least 104 people have been killed and more than 80 injured. An estimated 200 people are missing and feared dead. Thousands of homes have been destroyed and scores of ships capsized. It's the 8th typhoon to hit China already this year. The death toll for the year has now passed 1,700. More than 600 people died in typhoons just last month. In other news, new satellite data shows Greenland's ice sheet is melting at a faster pace than expected. According to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Greenland lost more than double the amount of cubic miles of ice than it's believed to have lost in previous years. In Iran, the government has announced a ban on the legal rights group headed by Nobel Peace Prize-winning lawyer Shirin Ebadi. The Interior Ministry says the Center for Defense of Human Rights is illegal because it did not apply for a proper permit. Tehran says it will now prosecute any of the group's activities. Ebadi's group has been leading advocate for hundreds of persecuted dissidents, journalists, and academics. Sarah Lee Whitson, director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East division, said, quote, "If Ebadi is threatened for defending human rights, then no one who works for human rights can feel safe from government prosecution." You can go to our website at democracynow.org to hear our hour with Shirin Ebadi after she won the Nobel Peace Prize. Here in the United States, a federal judge has issued a ruling civil liberties advocates say will hold major implications for freedom of speech. On Thursday, a federal judge ruled private citizens can be prosecuted if the government decides they've received or disclosed information harmful to national security. The ruling comes in the case against 2 former employees of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. They've been charged with passing on classified government information to the Israeli government. U.S. District Judge T.S. Ellis III rejected defense efforts to dismiss the case on the grounds their indictment infringes on their constitutional right to free speech. The two lobbyists are the first non-government civilians charged under the nearly 80-year-old Espionage Act with verbally receiving and transmitting national defense information. If upheld, the ruling could affect reporters who've exposed scandals and national security cases, including prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib. In Florida, a police chief has apologized after he was caught on tape laughing about a demonstrator who'd been shot in the head. The shooting occurred during the Miami protests against the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas in November of 2003. The demonstrator, Elizabeth Ritter, was hit by police with rubber bullets and struck again in the forehead as she lay on the ground. On a newly released police training video taped the following day of Broward County Major John Brooks is seen cheering colleagues, saying, quote, "I was so pumped up about how good you guys were." Another officer is seen imitating the moment Elizabeth Ritter was shot. The officer says, quote, "I don't know who got her, but it went right through the sign and hit her smack dab in the middle of her head." There are 6 pending lawsuits against the Miami Police Department for its conduct during the FTAA protests. In other news, the American Psychological Association has passed a measure condemning the involvement of psychologists in torture. But some members say it doesn't go far enough. The measure affirms the APA's existing policy allowing psychologists to take part in military interrogations. Leonard Rubenstein, executive director of Physicians for Human Rights, said, quote, "There is no way for the APA to be involved in those interrogations without becoming complicit in torture." Both the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association have already passed resolutions against physician involvement in prisoner interrogation. A new study is bolstering a long-held claim for advocates for immigrant rights. According to the Pew Hispanic Center, there's no evidence large increases in immigration have hurt job prospects for American workers. The group compared state-by-state immigration numbers with unemployment levels. The researchers could find no clear correlation between the two. And finally, thousands of people are expected to converge in Washington, D.C. Saturday for a demonstration against U.S. support for Israel's attacks on Lebanon and the Gaza Strip. Organizers are calling the protest the largest mobilization of the Arab American, Muslim, and U.S. peace movement in more than 4 years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers. Britain has named 19 of the 24 people arrested yesterday on suspicion of plotting to blow up passenger jets flying to the United States and has frozen their assets. Police said the plan was to take liquid explosives disguised as drinks on up to 10 planes with detonators hidden in electronic devices. All of those arrested are British citizens aged 17 to 35 and lived in areas of East London, High Wycombe, and Birmingham. Most are believed to be of Pakistani descent. One of the suspects was said to be a young mother, though Scotland Yard has not officially confirmed this. British authorities say that they have been investigating the group for about a year. Under new anti-terror laws, police have up to 28 days to question the suspects before deciding whether to charge or release them.
Pakistan says it played a role in the thwarting of the suspected plot. A senior Pakistani government official said 2 British nationals arrested in Pakistan last week provided key information. While British authorities said all the main figures had been caught, ABC News quoted unnamed U.S. officials as saying 5 suspects were still on the loose. Authorities said the airlines to be targeted were United, American, and Continental, bound for New York, Washington, and California. Hours after news of the arrest broke, President Bush spoke about the alleged plot.
The recent arrests that our fellow citizens are now learning about are a stark reminder that this nation is at war with Islamic fascists who will use any means to destroy those of us who love freedom, to hurt.
The suspected plot sparked chaos at Britain's airports at the height of the summer holiday season, with hundreds of flights canceled as airlines imposed strict security measures. Armed police have been deployed in many airports, and passengers are no longer allowed to take their hand luggage into the plane. Salma Yaqub is joining us now on the line from Britain. She's the head of the Birmingham Stop the War Coalition, founder of Respect, the Unity Coalition in England. This year, she won a seat on the Birmingham City Council and became the first elected hijab-wearing councillor in the city. We're also joined by Milan Rai, co-founder of the groups Justice Not Vengeance and Voices in the Wilderness. His latest book is called 7/7, The London Bombings, Islam and the Iraq War. We welcome you both to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to have you both with us. And I know, Salma, you're on the road with a cell phone, so we appreciate you pulling over to the side to talk with us. Let's begin with you, Milan. If you could talk about the climate in Britain right now and the response to what the British government says was a plot. They say they have arrested about 24 people. It looks like they're of Pakistani descent. They're British citizens.
I think that there's a bit of hesitancy even in the mainstream media and mainstream political opinion because of the massive blunders which there have been with British intelligence. So the Forest Gate incident 2 months ago, when 200 armed police dressed in chemical and biological warfare suits raided a house in East London and shot one of the men inside it, only to discover that there wasn't anything there and no terrorism-related charges were laid on anyone connected with that house. So there's a real sense of hesitancy about fully accepting what the government is saying. However, obviously, as details emerge, then that will change. I think that there's a certain stiff upper lip attitude in Britain, which is partly to do with the way in which Britain has dealt with the long-running IRA campaign, which was running up until a few years ago. And so that has kind of conditioned people's response to these kinds of incidents also.
And Salma Yaqub, some of those arrested were from Birmingham, and the names have been released by the British government today. Any of those names are familiar to you at all, or what's the reaction in Birmingham?
No, none of the names are familiar to me personally, but the reaction in Birmingham is one of shock. People gearing up, for the holidays, and this has just come out of the blue for many people. And also a real feeling of cynicism as well, as Milan pointed out, because there have been so many blunders. I mean, he mentioned the Forest Gate incident, which was a recent one. We've had the ricin plot, which in the end turned out not to be a ricin plot. Manchester Football Stadium, we were told there was a huge terrorist plot there, then it turned out there wasn't anything. The Brazilian young man was shot last year. And we were told at that time, no, we're 100% confident we've got a terrorist here. And so because of this, there's a measure of caution in the general public in accepting what is going on. And also because the timing of this, with Prime Minister Blair coming under so much pressure. Just last weekend, we had 100,000 people demonstrating against his support for Israel and America with what's happening in Lebanon at the moment. And so people are a bit skeptical, and people are saying, we don't know whether these men are innocent or not. They may well be guilty, but why are we hearing about these arrests before even charges have been laid upon them? And why don't we find out at the end of a process, at the end of a trial, when all the evidence is there, and then let's bring this out in the public?
You mentioned some of these other alleged plots. Maybe some Americans here are not familiar with some of them. The Manchester Club plot, I think there were about 10 people originally arrested on that. Could you talk a little bit about that and what happened?
Well, basically, we had the headline news that, people going to this football match, which obviously people love going to, it's a national sport, that there was a terror plot and that people would be blown up. And yet then it emerged later on that there was no such plot. We heard about ricin, this dangerous element, biological warfare, in our streets. And after a trial, actually emerged that the evidence just did not stand up, and the men were released. But the fear, the panic, the feeling of being under siege, of course, that you don't erase. And we do have a climate of fear. Just last night, we've had a mosque attacked in Chester using flammable liquid. So we're already seeing the backlash start, and this is what also people here fear with our different communities here, that whole communities come under that suspicion, whole communities come under that demonization. So people are saying we want to see hard, cold facts. Already we're seeing the politicization of this information. We have President Bush coming out saying, see, we told you so, it's all about Islamo-fascists. You can see how the judicial process itself becomes corrupted, and one has to question who is gaining by the use of this information at this stage in an investigation.
Milan Rai, what about this use of the term, and we're seeing it here more and more in the United States, of Islamo-fascists?
Well, I think that here in Britain, and I guess in the US as well, there's been a bit of a split personality as far as the government's attitude towards the Muslim community is concerned, where on the one hand there's lots of warm words, there's lots of ennobling of particular favored leaders within the Muslim community and so on, and on the other hand there's a way of speaking about Muslims, and there's a way of treating Muslims through the police and intelligence operations and so on, which merely increase alienation. And in fact, that was explicitly stated by the most senior Muslim police officer in Britain, who said the way that counterterrorism is being pursued is deepening alienation. Islamofascism is a kind of handy term for demonizing one particular strand of the militant forms of Islamic, violent forms of Islamic fundamentalism, and what the Bush administration has always been trying to do is always been trying to draw on the moral legitimacy of the Second World War, and trying to refer to the Axis powers, and trying to raise what they are doing to the level of the fight against fascism and Nazism in the Second World War. And it's nothing of the kind. Al-Qaeda is not a single unitary military-style organization. It's a network of networks. It's a loose association of people who are inspired by Osama bin Laden and what he calls for, but who are not commanded by him or any small leadership group around him. And I think we're seeing even now in the mainstream media cautionary words from within the security and intelligence services saying, we don't know whether this has any connection to Osama bin Laden and the core Al-Qaeda leadership. This may be completely unconnected, just as the 7th of July attacks appear to have been very nearly completely unconnected to the Al-Qaeda leadership, and only connected by the passing of a video statement to the Al-Qaeda leadership without them having any command over the operation.
And Milan, in England, as here in the United States, there have been many people picked up, detained on suspicion of connection to or involvement with terrorism. Could you talk a little bit about the numbers there in Britain, and how many have actually been successfully prosecuted?
I don't have those figures to hand, to be honest. There is something of a dispute going on between the police and Muslim leaders about exactly how many of those detentions under counter-terror powers have led to any charges being preferred or any kind of terrorist-related prosecutions of any kind. The overall profile of it is exactly the same as we saw with the Irish community with the Prevention of Terrorism Act during the 1970s and 80s, where we had a huge arrest rate and a very tiny prosecution rate, or in terms of actually taking forward terrorism-related charges. And all of this harassment, which is what it amounts to, is contributing towards alienation, and that's something that the government itself has acknowledged, as we know through the leaked Young Muslims and Extremism report, which came out just a few days after the 7th of July attacks. And that report also said that the primary motive creating alienation amongst young Muslims and a drive towards extremism was British foreign policy and the way that it affected Muslims around the world.
The fact that raids, I don't know if they're still going on, but have been through the last day in Wickham, a place where some of those from the 7/7 bombings last year, the train bombings happened. Milan?
Well, there were three of the bombers were from a suburb of Leeds, and one of them was from the High Wycombe sort of area. So what we're hearing now is that most of these people who have been arrested are British-born. What we're hearing is that most of them come out of the Pakistani community. What we're hearing is that quite a few of them are middle class and well-educated and so on, which is, if it turns out to be well-founded, and if it turns out these people actually have anything to do with a terrorist plot, which we don't know right now, but if all of that is the case, then that would fit in with pretty much the global picture of the kind of people who are involved in this kind of a thing, which is, it is better educated people. It is people who have possibly a stake in society, possibly could have a better kind of a life than the average Muslim in the world or Muslim in any Western country. And it's some of those kinds of people who feel apparently drawn to, in their eyes, defend Muslims around the world from Western assault. And when we look at what British suicide bombers have said in the past, and we know about ones before the 7th of July as well, the pair who struck in Israel, Richard Reed and the shoe bomber and so on, when we look at what they say, what they keep saying over and over again is that they conceive of their actions as a form of self-defense by the global Muslim community against Western foreign policy and its brutal impact. That's how they see it. That doesn't mean it's justified, but that means that if we want to reduce their motivation to carry out these attacks, then we have to do something about these foreign policies, which are objected to by the majority of people in Britain and the United States, Muslim and non-Muslim.
And Salma Yaqub, you are an elected city councilor, recently won the election in Birmingham, but you're also at the same time an anti-war activist. How would this alleged plot and these arrests, do you think, are going to affect the anti-war movement? And how are you counseling Muslims in Birmingham now to react to this situation?
Well, as far as a response, obviously we have to be dignified and just in our response. The fact is our country is under a greater terror threat now. We can give the political reasons for that. I mean, the security services themselves said that with Britain's involvement in Afghanistan, in Iraq, that our country would be more at risk. This is not about religion. It's about people taking what they call revenge. Their logic is, if you use violence, we can also use violence. We're seeing it around the world. So what people in anti-war movements have been saying from the beginning is address the root causes. This is not appeasement. This is saying if you really want to stop terrorism, stop the state terrorism. When we have a double standard, we have states with their army of aeroplanes already, what we're seeing in Lebanon, for example, is 30,000 sorties a day. 1,000 civilians have already been killed. And yet we're not hearing the talk about state terrorism at all. We're hearing about Hezbollah. Yes, Hezbollah also have a role to play in this, but they will say that we're defending our country against an invasion. Lebanon did not invade Israel. That's the fact. Yet when we hear these kind of discourses in an unequal way, some people then become very enraged and they don't address that politically. In the anti-war movement, what we're saying is we want to do things peacefully. We want to address things politically. And that's why people are frustrated with their own leaders, with Prime Minister Blair, saying we can't talk peace, we can't talk politics. If you are determined to use bombs and violence yourself, you are then helping to instigate a cycle of violence. And it's innocent people who bear the brunt of that.
Salma Yaqub and Milan Rai, I want to thank you both very much for joining us. Salma Yaqub is head of the Birmingham Stop the War Coalition, founder and vice chair of the Respect Unity Coalition in England, the political party, and is a councillor, city councillor in Birmingham. Milan Rai, co-founder of the group Justice Not Vengeance, and is author of the book 7/7, The London Bombings, Islam, and the Iraq War. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. When we come back, a Democracy Now! Exclusive. In this first time he is speaking out, and Army interrogator went to Iraq, came home, and went AWOL for a year. He says he won't return to Iraq. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over now 500 stations throughout North and South America, on Pacifica and NPR stations, low-power FM, college and community radio stations, public access TV and PBS stations, and on both TV satellite networks, on Dish Network Channel 9415 Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on DirecTV Channel 375. And we are also video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are there in Spanish in both transcript form as well as in audio, and any radio station can broadcast those headlines in Spanish as well. And we hope you go to our website, read the stories, pass them around to friends, and also sign up for our daily headlines at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Pentagon is now estimating that as many as 40,000 troops have deserted the U.S. Armed Forces over the past 6 years. Many have refused to fight in Iraq. Today, we're joined by an Army sergeant who chose to serve in Iraq as an Army interrogator with the 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Bragg. But he became a war resister after witnessing how the war was being fought. His name is Sergeant Ricky Klausing. He's a 24-year-old from Sumner, Washington. He served in Iraq from December 2004 till April 2005. Within months after returning home, he went AWOL.
In June 2005, Sergeant Klausing sneaked out of Fort Bragg in the middle of the night. He left behind a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. It read, quote, "Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? But conscience asks the question, is it right?" And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but because conscience tells one it is right. Those are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. Today, Sergeant Ricky Klausing plans to go to Fort Lewis in Washington to turn himself in to military officials. But first, in this first national live broadcast after going AWOL, he joins us in a studio in Seattle. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Sergeant Ricky Klausing.
Thank you.
It's very good to have you with us. Why did you go AWOL?
I chose to leave after experiencing the brutalities of war and this war in Iraq, and it was a process that I considered long and hard upon my return to Fort Bragg. Those 2.5 months of my integration back into the military and back into society really questioned and really forced me to reevaluate my beliefs and my own personal feelings and convictions politically and spiritually about my involvement in the war in Iraq and also the organization of the military in general.
So, could you talk to us about some of your specific experiences while you were there? My understanding is you actually witnessed some killings of innocent civilians that really affected you deeply.
Yes, I was assigned to a tactical infantry unit, which meant basically that I was out on patrols with infantry units. The particular incident that you're referring to, I was in Mosul on a convoy en route, and we stopped to assist another convoy that had been struck by an IED. And during that time, I was ordered to pull rear security on the convoy, where I proceeded to go behind the rear Humvee and guard the road, basically to ensure that nobody turned down and posed a threat to U.S. forces assisting soldiers in their personal crisis, what was going on with IED. As I was doing that, I seen a vehicle turn down our road going approximately 15 miles an hour. I saw directly in the window was a young boy, or a young man, I should say, and as soon as he saw U.S. troops, he was terrified, took his hands off the wheel. It was evident that he was scared that U.S. troops were there, weapons drawn. He didn't know what was going on. He was making an effort to brake the vehicle and to turn around immediately when a soldier in the turret of the Humvee behind me proceeded to open up fire and fired 4 to 5 rounds on the side of the vehicle. I went over to the vehicle with a medic and broke the window out and dragged the civilian into the road, which is common to provide first aid upon injured civilians and even insurgents. But I looked down at him as the medic was performing first aid, and the situation obviously was I was in shock. I didn't know what was going on. It was really fast. But as I looked down in the eyes of the boy, I could tell that he was just scared, he was frightened, and I mean, I don't speak Arabic, and obviously there was no words exchanged, but I could look into his eyes and see that he was confused and hurt and didn't know what was going on. I could sense that from his soul he was crying out, why is this happening to me? What's going on? What did I do? I was turning my car around. I spoke with the leaders afterwards and told them that basically they needed to instruct their soldiers to assess and analyze the situation properly, as the proper procedures were neglected. The escalation of force by waving of the arms and firing a warning shot, and then proceeding to try to disengage the vehicle by shooting the tires. And then actually if the vehicle doesn't stop and it poses a threat, still you're authorized to engage into the vehicle and engage the civilian. All of those procedures were ignored, and it was directly, basically the civilian was fired on immediately. And I thought that this Iraqi died innocently, and I was really disturbed by it, really shook my foundation of why I thought we were there. And I had skepticism before, but that particular incident, along with some other ones, really just made me second guess what we were doing there and what really is happening.
Did you raise it with your superiors?
I did raise it to the superiors that were in charge of the convoy, I did.
And what did they say?
I brought it up to them, and it was hard for me to do that because I was never deployed before, because I wasn't an infantry soldier. I was a military intelligence soldier attached to these infantry guys. But when I did, I spoke what I felt I needed to say and bring up issues that needed to be questioned and concerned. And when I did, I was really shot down by the superiors, basically that I didn't know how convoy operations worked, and I had never been deployed before, and I didn't understand that this happens, and that that's just something, a reality of war, and that I apparently didn't know what I was talking about.
And how prevalent, in your experience, were these kinds of incidents of innocent civilians being needlessly killed?
I myself only witnessed this particular incident where an innocent civilian was killed. Although, because I was an interrogator, my security clearance granted me access to the S2 room, which is the intelligence briefing room. It's where they have all the intelligence updates. There's a board called the Daily Intelligence Summary, and that holds information on how many times in our area of operation that soldiers have received small arms fire, how many IEDs have gone off, and also number of local nationals or non-combatant Iraqi civilians that are killed. And as I said, I only saw this personally one time, but the number of innocent Iraqis killed on the leaderboard or on the intelligence board definitely climbed the whole time I was in Iraq. It gradually increased day by day that we were there in the sector.
It's called the Bleeder Board?
It's an intelligence summary board, basically of all the updates in the area of operation that we conduct in, all of the significant events.
Sergeant Ricky Clausing, can you go back to the beginning and tell us when and why you joined the military, the Army?
I joined in 2002. I was actually taking some time off school, and I was doing some mission work in Thailand in an orphanage, and I ended up coming back from that trip and not knowing whether to pursue school or not. So I moved to Europe to live with my father for a little while, and I was there for about 4 months, backpacking around, just traveling, and I encountered soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, which was fairly after 9/11, fairly short after that, and I really just started considering the possibility of serving in the military in this new era of these all new ideas that have been thrown out there. So I started contemplating. I went and spoke with a recruiter, and the job title that seemed appealing to me was an interrogator, partly because of the nature of the job and also because of the possibility to learn a foreign language and just the new experiences that I would have.
And when you decided to go AWOL, could you take us through some of your thoughts then and why you decided you had to do this?
Well, as I said, the particular incident that I saw definitely disturbed me. There's a number of other incidences that happened that really added to my confusion and my my conflict of conscience, you could say. And it really, although some might call these incidents isolated, and even in the media, you watch on the news the events that happened in Haditha, you read about the 14-year-old girl that was raped and killed by soldiers, or even the abuses of Abu Ghraib. Every month or every couple months, there's always a headline issue, it seems to be, that there's some sort of abuse of power that's going on in Iraq. But what's not really covered by the media and what really isn't spoken about are the daily injustices that happen. And my experiences over there were daily injustices, which included that innocent civilian that was killed. But as I said, there was also a number of other incidences where, to sum it up, I really saw the physical, psychological, and emotional harassment of civilians. The abuse of power that goes on in Iraq each day really was just not, I believe, should not be tolerated. And these events aren't covered by the media. So those events that I witnessed and I was exposed to really forced me to second guess my ability to perform daily functions as a soldier, to train my soldiers that I was in charge of, and to be trained. I was basically I felt stuck in my situation where I really felt like, as I got home, I really dug into information leading up to the war in Iraq and also to foreign policy in general. And I just really was, I felt stuck that I'm in an organization right now that I'm discovering, based on my experiences and the knowledge that I'm reading, that I really do not believe that I can honorably serve and be a part of.
Sergeant Klausing, so, we have to break for 60 seconds. We're going to come back. We want to talk to you about that process that night when you left Fort Bragg, and also what you've done over this past year. It has been difficult. You've gone AWOL. Today, you'll be holding a news conference in Washington State and turning yourself in, and we would like to talk about that as well. We're talking to Sergeant Ricky Klausing, speaking out nationally for the first time. Today, he will turn himself in Fort Lewis. Stay with us.
The young land started growing, the young blood started flowing, but I ain't a-marching anymore. For I killed my share of Injuns in 1,000 different fights. I was there at the Little Big Horn. I heard many men a-lying, I saw many more a-dying, but I ain't a-marching anymore. It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I stole California from the Mexican land, fought in the bloody Civil War. Yes, I even killed my brothers and so many others, but I ain't a-marching anymore. For I marched to the battles of the German trench in a war that was bound to end all wars. Oh, I must have killed 1 million men and now they want me back again, but I ain't a-marching anymore. It's always
Phil Oakes, I ain't marching anymore. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest in Seattle today is speaking out nationally for the first time. His name is Sergeant Ricky Klausing, served as an Army interrogator in Iraq from December 2004 to April 2005. This is more than a year later. Ricky Klausing, what did you do the night you left Fort Bragg, and did others there know that you were leaving, placing that quote of Dr. Martin Luther King, leaving it behind you and walking out of the base?
Well, I didn't actually plan a day that I was going to depart from my unit. Like I mentioned a little bit before, it was a process of when I integrated back home, of my feelings really intensifying over time. And it intensified to the point in June where I really felt like the only decision that I had in obeying my conscience and living honorably was to separate myself from the military in that way. So nobody else in my unit knew that I was going to be leaving. I didn't talk to anybody about it. I knew this was the time I had to move and I had to separate myself. As you mentioned, I left a note on my door explaining my feelings, which my unit was well aware of. My superiors already understood my conflict. And I left a quote by Martin Luther King, which you read earlier, which I feel kind of explained in a summary of how I felt in the whole matter.
What about your fellow soldiers? Did any of them share your frustration and your disillusionment with what was going on there, or were you pretty much a loner on this issue?
When I was in Iraq, I was primarily attached to infantry units, so I was around a different mentality of soldiers. When I returned home and spoke to some of the people that I had trained with and stuff in my intelligence unit, there's definitely, even among the infantry soldiers, there's absolutely a feeling of confusion, a feeling of questioning whether or not we're actually in Iraq for the reasons we were told, because men and women are dying each day. You know, even these infantry guys are losing their friends each day in roadside bombs, losing their friends in gunfire attacks, and absolutely, I mean, people are wondering, why am I here? I mean, I was sent here for a reason, and people still, soldiers in particular, they definitely feel this question of what is really going on. It's not so much spoken about on a big platform, because it's kind of like this inner question that I had before I went to Iraq as well. It's just that the experiences that I had really kind of forced me to deal with these questions on the forefront, kind of like compelled me to answer them.
Sergeant Clausing, last November we interviewed a former U.S. Army interrogator specialist. His name is Tony Lagaranis. He too served in Iraq. He was at Abu Ghraib beginning in April 2004. He was in other places as well, began to speak out about what he witnessed there. During the interview, he talked about the methods of interrogation he used.
We were using dogs in the Mosul detention facility, which was at the Mosul airport. We would put the prisoner in a shipping container. We would keep him up all night with music and strobe lights, stress positions, and then we would bring in dogs. And the prisoner was blindfolded, so he didn't really understand what was going on, but we had the dog controlled. He was being held by a military police dog handler on a leash, and the dog was muzzled, so he couldn't hurt the prisoner. That was the only time I ever saw dogs used in Iraq.
Did the prisoner know that there was a muzzle on the dog?
No, because he was blindfolded. So the dog would be, you know, barking and jumping on the prisoner, and the prisoner wouldn't really understand what was going on.
What did you think of this practice that you were engaging in?
Well, I knew that we were really walking the line, and I was going through the interrogation rules of engagement that was given to me by the unit that we were working with up there, trying to figure out what was legal, what wasn't legal. And according to this interrogation rules of engagement, that was legal. So when they ordered me to do it, I had to do it. And you know, as far as whether, you know, I thought it was a good interrogation practice, I didn't think so at all, actually. We never produced any intelligence.
Former Army interrogator Tony Lagaranis talking about his experiences. You too were in Mosul, Sergeant Ricky Clausing, as well as Baghdad. Did you have experiences like this, you too, an Army interrogator?
I actually was never exposed to the mistreatment of prisoners. It could have been because of the differences between the specific unit I was working with. There's two separate possibilities basically for an interrogator. You're basically assigned to a strategic unit, which are a lot of those units are they're basically not attached to infantry units. They're not an infantry support unit. Those are the interrogators that were at Abu Ghraib. Those are the interrogators that are at Guantanamo Bay, and a lot of the larger interrogation facilities. Those are strategic unit interrogators. It just happened to be primarily because of my airborne qualification that I was stationed with the 82nd Airborne, which happens to be a tactical infantry unit. So because of that, my interrogation experiences were tactical questioning out in the city after raids, after searches and whatnot, but also in the interrogation facilities. But during my time in the interrogation facility, I never witnessed, like I said, mistreatment of prisoners. My unit back at Fort Bragg was very adamant and was very particular about the treatment and the proper handling of prisoners. But however, I did hear stories from other interrogators in Iraq that things went on. I heard stories from Abu Ghraib and other detention facilities of methods used, in using dogs as one of them, using some of the interrogation practices now that are deemed inhumane, I guess. I've heard of stories like that. The common idea and a lot of the mentality in the military is out of sight, out of mind, and that definitely prevails in that instance with interrogations being held in Iraq.
Well, Sergeant, next Thursday, U.S. Army First Lieutenant Aaron Watado is going to face a pretrial hearing for refusing to deploy to Iraq. 2 months ago, he became the first commissioned officer to publicly refuse deployment. This is an excerpt of a video recording he issued at the time explaining why he's refusing to fight.
The war in Iraq violates our democratic system of checks and balances. It usurps international treaties and conventions that by virtue of the Constitution become American law. The wholesale slaughter and mistreatment of Iraqis is not only a terrible moral injustice, but it is a contradiction to the Army's own law of land warfare. My participation would make me party to war crimes. Normally, those in the military have allowed others to speak for them and act on their behalf. I believe that time has come to an end.
First, Lieutenant Aaron Watado, he's in Washington State. Suzanne Swift, who also went AWOL and was confined to the Fort Lewis base from Eugene and Washington. Also, James Yee, the chaplain who was arrested from Guantanamo, comes from Olympia, Washington. And now you today here in Seattle, you're going to Fort Lewis. Can you talk about the atmosphere in Washington State? Why do you think there are so many of you? Are we just hearing people going public in Washington State? After all, we hear there are tens of thousands of people who've left the military, according to the Pentagon's figures.
I think that there's definitely a wide amount of people that feel the same feelings I have, the same questions that Lieutenant Watado had, as many, just like a lot of the other war resistors that are standing up. Going public is something that is basically an individual choice that has to be made. That I know other soldiers who have left AWOL and other soldiers who even would like to leave AWOL. I don't think it's necessarily that the Northwest is particular to those people. It does so happen to be that Suzanne Swift is from the Northwest. I myself am from the Northwest. Lieutenant Watado is from Hawaii. He's stationed here in the Northwest. But I would definitely say that there is a progressive idea of involvement and a collective consciousness here about questioning politics and questioning what's going on in Iraq, which really needs to involve our whole society. I think that that's the kind of the lack of civil responsibility, I maybe could say, that people in this nation have kind of stepped back from and not understood that not only are soldiers really responsible for, certain situations they find themselves in Iraq. I think as a whole, our society really needs to step back and realize what's going on in Iraq, and that we are directly and indirectly responsible for the injustices happening over there, whether you're military or not. If you're a civilian and you don't speak out against what's going on and don't make an attempt to understand it and then do something about it, I think we all share the same responsibility. So, like I said, going public is one way I chose that I felt like I wanted to share my experiences in Iraq and shed light on a window of reality that I think that has kind of been absent from the media, which is, like I said, the daily abuse of power that goes without accountability.
Let me ask you, you've been in hiding now for over a year. Could you talk about that experience? Were you aware of any attempts by the Army to track you down or to detain you? What's been the reaction of your family and your friends to your situation?
I've been very grateful that my family has been very supportive of me. They've loved on me this whole time I've been gone. They've been really supportive of me my friends as well. I've had friends in different parts of the country that are standing by me, even friends that don't necessarily agree with my politics of my decision. They still know that I'm a person of conviction, and they still support my decision. The last year has been obviously an interesting year, where I was really trying to piece together a lot of ideas, where as a 24-year-old man trying to recalculate my worldview and my perception of not only the military but of our government and my association in it and my involvement and my responsibilities. These are all questions that I've pondered and thought about the last year. I spent a lot of the year in reflection, and a lot of it really trying to just be centered and yeah, like I said, come to grips with a lot of these questions and answers.
Sergeant Klausing, today you're going to hold a news conference, and then tell us how the day will proceed. You're turning yourself in after a year.
Yes, there's a news conference planned today at 9 o'clock Pacific time, where it's actually in coordination with the Vets for Peace Conference and with the Iraq Veterans Against the War. I'm going to be kind of speaking out not only for myself but also just in support of the war resistors, but that's going to happen at 9 o'clock Pacific time for approximately an hour. And then at the conclusion, as you mentioned, I'm going to drive down to Fort Lewis and surrender myself to military custody.
And what will happen to you then?
It's basically dependent upon the military's reaction of what will happen. I don't know what to expect, or I can't make speculations at this time. I have no idea.
I'd like to ask you, during the year that you've been in hiding, obviously you've had a chance to see news coverage on the 6 o'clock news or in the newspapers here in this country of the war in Iraq, and the reported death tolls now of 100 people a day being killed. What do you think, given your experience, what are the American people missing in what they're getting from the reporting from our own media here about the war?
As I mentioned before, I really think there's just an indifference, and also really these incidences that keep being thrown into the media, these huge tragic events, seem to be discovered. I mean, they're not brought up by media, and they're not brought into the light of the population because of a moral issue. Is this right? They're not questioning the basis of the war in general. They're just saying this event was discovered, so we have the responsibility to report that to our people.
Haditha, Mahmoudiyya, did these surprise you?
They actually didn't. I mean, my experience, especially working with infantry soldiers and seeing their reaction in circumstances that they're put in, it didn't surprise me, because I think that these events that you're talking about and the experiences that I saw are basically a larger picture of the daily devastation in Iraq and the symptom of the dehumanization of the Iraqi people and the dehumanization that happens as a soldier naturally of being able to take another person's life for whatever reason. It's just, these are just symptoms of the larger problem that really America has neglected to face in the last 3 years, and that need to be talked about. They need to be brought into the media. These daily, like you mentioned, the 100 people that are dying a day in Iraq, these issues need to be brought up. The mistreatment of prisoners, the mistreatment of civilians, whether or not they're detained or not.
Sergeant Klausing, we just have 10 seconds, but you're now turning yourself in. Are you willing to go to jail for going AWOL, absent without leave?
I knew when I made my decision that there would be consequences, and I felt like I needed to be true to my conscience. So whatever the result is, I feel at peace, and I feel calm and collected that this is destiny and that I'm standing up for what I really believe in.
Sergeant Ricky Klausing, I want to thank you for joining us. We will certainly follow this case in a Monday report to our listeners and viewers about what has taken place, speaking to us from Seattle, turning himself in at the base at Fort Lewis. That does it for today's broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Sharif Abdokadus, John Hamilton, Elizabeth Press, Yoruba Richin, Frank Lopez, Jen Utes, Mike DeFilippo is our engineer. Our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.